My name is Charles. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in a field where being careful matters more than being loud. I've always been the kind of person who listens longer than he speaks, the kind who reads contracts twice, the kind who notices small details most people walk past without ever seeing. To people who don't know me well, that quietness can look like hesitation or weakness. I've been underestimated more times than I can count, not because I lack confidence, but because I don't feel the need to prove it out loud. If you met me at a family dinner, you probably wouldn't remember much about me afterward. I'm not the one telling the longest stories at the table. I'm not the one raising my voice to win arguments. I usually sit near the end, listening, occasionally smiling, asking a question when it matters. For a long time, that was the role people placed me in: reliable, polite, conveniently quiet. My in laws were especially comfortable with that version of me. To them, I was the calm husband who rarely objected, the man who helped with practical things, the one who handled paperwork when it appeared but otherwise stayed respectfully in the background. And for years, I let that image stand, not because I agreed with everything that happened around me, but sometimes silence feels easier than conflict. Sometimes keeping peace feels more important than correcting every assumption people make about you. What I didn't realize at the time was how easily quietness can be mistaken for permission. This story begins in the home my wife grew up in, a house filled with strong personalities, long family traditions, and expectations that weren't always spoken out loud, but were understood by everyone who lived there, or almost everyone. Because eventually, there came a day when my in-laws looked at me across their dining table and told me something very simple. They told me it was time for me to leave the family home. No argument, no long discussion, just a decision that had apparently already been made. What they didn't know was that by the time that conversation happened, I had already learned something they had never noticed. And the only thing I needed to respond was one document. This isn't a story about revenge. No shouting, no dramatic confrontations. Just a sequence of quiet choices made slowly over time that eventually led to a moment where the room went completely silent. And sometimes silence tells you more about people than words ever could. Before I tell you how all of that unfolded, let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where people misunderstood your silence and assumed it meant you had no power at all? If you had asked my in-laws to describe me during the first few years of my marriage, their answers would probably have sounded polite, safe, almost complimentary. Charles is very calm. He's practical. He's not the kind who makes trouble. Those kinds of descriptions sound positive on the surface, and in many ways, they were. I never had the sense that my wife's parents openly disliked me. There were no loud confrontations, no dramatic moments where someone slammed a door or raised their voice. But there is a difference between being accepted and being taken seriously. And for a long time, I don't think they saw much difference between the two. My wife, Emma, came from a family that had always done things a certain way. Her parents had lived in the same house in Manchester for more than 30 years, a large brick home that had slowly become the center of everything: holidays, birthdays, Sunday dinners. Even when Emma and I married, it felt less like leaving that house and more like orbiting around it. Eventually, after a series of small circumstances, her father's health scare, Emma wanting to be closer to help, and what seemed like a practical decision at the time, we moved into the house as well. The arrangement was described as temporary, just until things settle, her mother had said. That was the phrase everyone used. But months have a way of quietly turning into years. At first, I tried to be helpful wherever I could. I fixed things around the house, handled paperwork when bills or contracts needed reviewing, quiet tasks that no one else particularly wanted to deal with. Emma's father, Richard, appreciated that, at least in his own reserved way. "You're good with documents," he once told me while sliding a folder across the dining table. It wasn't praise, exactly, more like an observation. Her mother, Margaret, had a different way of interacting with the world. She was the kind of person who ran a household like a small government, every detail organized, every decision carefully monitored. And over time, I started to notice something subtle in the way she spoke to me. Not unkind, but simplified. When conversations about family matters happened, Margaret often directed them toward Emma or Richard, even if I was sitting right there. If there was a question about plans for the house, she would say things like, "Emma, what do you think about that?" Not, "What do you both think?" Just Emma. At first, I told myself it was natural. After all, it was Emma's childhood home. Her parents had spent decades building their lives there long before I ever arrived. So, I stayed in the background. When decisions were made about renovations, I helped coordinate the contractors. When legal letters arrived from the council, I reviewed them. When paperwork needed to be filed or organized, it somehow ended up in my hands. I became, slowly and almost invisibly, the person who handled the things that required patience. But patience has an interesting side effect. The more quietly you solve problems, the more people begin to assume the problems solved themselves. Over time, my role in that house became very clear. I was dependable, I was useful, and most importantly, I was quiet. The kind of presence that made other people's lives easier without demanding recognition for it. And I suppose, from their perspective, there was nothing wrong with that arrangement. But every role comes with an assumption. The assumption that the person playing it will always stay exactly where they are. What no one in that house realized, at least not yet, was that while they were becoming comfortable with who they thought I was quietly paying attention to everything. Not in a suspicious way, just the way someone does when they're used to reading fine print. Because small details, especially in families, have a habit of revealing much more than people intend. And the first time I truly noticed that, it came from something so small that no one else in the room even registered it. But I did. And once you see something like that, it becomes very hard to pretend you didn't. The first moment wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no argument, just a small sentence, spoken casually across a dinner table. But sometimes the smallest moments are the ones that stay with you the longest. It happened on a Sunday evening, the kind that had become routine in our house. Margaret believed strongly in family dinners. Everyone sitting down together, phones away, conversation flowing the way she liked it. That night, she had made roast chicken, which meant the kitchen smelled like rosemary and garlic long before anyone actually sat down. Emma and I arrived at the table last. Richard was already seated with his usual newspaper folded beside his plate, though he wasn't reading it anymore. Margaret moved around the table serving food with the quiet authority she carried into every room. "Emma, could you pass the potatoes?" Emma handed the dish across. Then Margaret turned toward me. "Charles, would you mind pouring the water?" It wasn't unusual. Small requests like that were normal in any household. I reached for the pitcher and filled the glasses without thinking much about it. The conversation moved along the way it always did. Updates about Emma's work, a neighbor's recent renovation, Richard mentioning something he'd read about property taxes increasing in the area. That last part caught my attention. "Council reassessment this year," Richard said, cutting into his chicken. Apparently, A few homes on this street might be affected. I had seen the letter earlier that week. In fact, I had already read the entire notice while organizing the stack of mail that arrived each morning. It wasn't anything alarming, but it did involve a procedural detail about how certain properties were classified. So, naturally, I spoke. There's a section in the notice about multi-occupancy registrations, I said calmly. If the council still lists the house under a single-family classification, the reassessment could change the tax bracket slightly. It was the kind of comment I made all the time at work. Neutral, informational, just context. Emma nodded slightly when I said it, as if acknowledging the detail. But Margaret barely paused while setting a dish back onto the table. "Oh, I'm sure the council knows what they're doing," she said lightly. Then she turned directly to Richard. "Richard, what do you think we should do if the tax changes?" It was subtle enough that no one reacted, but I noticed something immediately. She hadn't disagreed with what I said. She had simply moved around it, like stepping around a chair that someone left in the middle of the room. Richard shrugged. "Probably nothing until we see the bill." Margaret nodded, as if the discussion had reached its conclusion. The topic shifted within seconds to Emma's upcoming work trip, then to a neighbor's garden project. No one mentioned the council notice again. And in that moment, I realized something that had probably been happening for much longer than I'd understood. When I contributed something practical to a conversation, it was accepted in the same way someone accepts background noise, heard, but not really considered. I didn't feel angry about it. Not at that moment. If anything, I felt curious. Because it wasn't just about what Margaret had said. It was about how natural it seemed to everyone at the table. No tension, no awkward silence, just an unspoken agreement about who held weight in the room and who didn't. Later that night, after the dishes were done and Emma had gone upstairs, I passed through the dining room again. The council letter was still sitting on the sideboard where I had left it earlier. I picked it up and read the final page again, not because I had missed anything, but because I suddenly understood something important. In that house, my voice wasn't dismissed aggressively. It was simply unnecessary. And the difference between those two things is easy to overlook, unless you're paying attention, which, by that point, I had started doing much more carefully. After that dinner, nothing changed, at least not on the surface. The house continued to run exactly the way it always had. Margaret organized everything with the same quiet authority. Richard maintained his routines: morning tea by the window, afternoon walks down the street to check on the small garden he insisted he was still maintaining himself. Emma balanced work and family the way she had since we moved in, and I continued doing what I had always done, helping with the practical things, reviewing documents when they appeared, fixing small problems before they grew large enough for anyone else to notice, quietly keeping systems running the way they should. But once you begin to notice a pattern, it becomes difficult to stop seeing it. The council letter wasn't the only example. It was just the first moment that made the pattern visible. A few weeks later, a contractor came by to inspect the roof. There had been a small leak in the back extension after a particularly heavy rain. Margaret met him at the door. I was working from home that morning, so I stepped outside when I heard the conversation begin. The contractor explained that the damage was minor but recommended replacing part of the flashing before winter arrived. "Probably about 1,200 pounds, he said. Margaret frowned slightly. "That seems high." I asked a simple question. "Did you check the drainage along the gutter line?" I said. "If the runoff is pooling near the corner seam, the flashing might not be the root problem." The contractor paused. "Actually, that's a good point," he said. "I'll take another look." He walked around the side of the house to inspect the gutter. Margaret didn't respond to my comment. She simply crossed her arms and waited. A few minutes later, the contractor returned. "You're right," he said to me. "There's a partial blockage along the gutter channel. Clearing that might solve most of it." The repair estimate dropped by almost half. Margaret nodded politely. "Well, that's good news," she said. But when she turned back toward the contractor, she said something that caught my attention. "Richard usually handles these kinds of things," she explained. Richard wasn't even home. The contractor smiled politely and scribbled the revised estimate on his notepad. I didn't correct her. There didn't seem to be any point. Moments like that started happening more often once I became aware of them. Small adjustments in conversation, little redirections. If a decision needed to be made, Margaret naturally turned toward Emma or Richard, even when I had been the one handling the issue. Not out of hostility, just habit. And habits, once they settle into a family dynamic, can become surprisingly strong. Emma didn't notice it either. Or if she did, she never mentioned it. To her, everything probably felt normal. This had been her home since childhood. The rhythms of conversation, the roles people played, those things had been set long before I ever walked through the front door. So I told myself the same thing over and over. It's not important. Let it go. And most of the time, I did. Because speaking up about something that small would have felt unnecessary, even petty. But the truth is, when small moments repeat often enough, they stop feeling small. They begin to accumulate, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, in the background of your awareness, like a faint, ticking sound in a room you sit in every day. Eventually, you stop hearing it consciously, but it's still there, marking time. And somewhere along the way, without realizing it, I had started keeping track. Not in a notebook, not with any intention of confronting anyone, just mentally observing, understanding the role I had been placed in, and the one everyone else seemed comfortable with me staying in, the reliable one, the helpful one, the one who handled things quietly, the one whose presence made the house run smoothly without ever needing recognition for it. And for a long time, I convinced myself that it was perfectly fine until I realized something uncomfortable. In that house, being useful was appreciated, but being respected was a completely different category. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to fully understand the role I had been given in that house. Not because it was hidden, but because it had been presented so politely. When people treat you badly, the problem is obvious. You feel it immediately, sharp, undeniable. There's something clear to react to. But when people treat you well, just not quite as an equal, it's much harder to recognize. That's where I was. In many ways, Margaret and Richard were perfectly kind to me. They never insulted me. They never raised their voices. They thanked me when I fixed something or handled paperwork that no one else wanted to deal with. "Charles is so organized," Margaret would say to visitors sometimes. "Very dependable." Those words sounded positive. But the more I listened to them, the more I began to understand what they actually meant. Dependable people, in many families, become part of the infrastructure. Important, but not central. Like the beams holding up the ceiling, necessary for the house to function, but rarely the focus of attention. The real turning point in my understanding came during a small family gathering one Saturday afternoon. Emma's cousin Daniel had come over with his wife and 2 young children. The house was lively, in the way it often became when relatives visited, voices overlapping, people moving in and out of the kitchen. At one point, Daniel started talking about a small investment property he had been considering. "Thinking about buying a flat near the university," he said casually. "Rent demands pretty high there." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds promising." Daniel continued, explaining that he wasn't entirely sure how the leasehold regulations worked for older buildings in the area. I had actually dealt with something very similar at work not long before. So again, Naturally, I spoke. You might want to check the remaining lease term before committing, I said. If it drops below 80 years, lenders sometimes get cautious. It can affect both financing and resale. Daniel looked interested immediately. Oh, really? Before I could elaborate, Margaret stepped in. Richard has always been very good with property matters, she said warmly. Richard smiled slightly, but didn't say anything yet. The conversation shifted toward him as if pulled by gravity. Daniel leaned closer to Richard, asking questions about mortgages and property prices. Richard did his best to answer, though I could tell he wasn't particularly familiar with the leasehold detail I had mentioned. And again, the moment passed. No one had contradicted me. No one had dismissed what I said. They had simply redirected the conversation. Afterward, while clearing plates in the kitchen, Margaret said something that revealed more than she probably intended. You're always very helpful with practical things, Charles, she said pleasantly. Practical things. It sounded harmless, but the phrase lingered in my mind, because what she was really saying, without realizing it, was that my role had already been defined. I handled logistics, paperwork, small problems, quiet support. But the larger conversations, the ones about decisions and authority, those belonged to someone else. And once I recognized that pattern, I couldn't unsee it. It wasn't malicious. It was simply comfortable for them. Everyone in that house had a position. Margaret was the organizer. Richard was the authority. Emma was the bridge between generations. And I was the quiet one who kept things running in the background. The system worked that way smoothly, at least for everyone else. But what no one realized, not even Emma, was that the moment you fully understand the role people have assigned you is also the moment you gain the ability to decide whether you want to keep playing it. And that realization arrived on a completely ordinary afternoon. An afternoon when nothing dramatic happened. No argument, no accusation, just a quiet moment that changed the way I looked at everything that came after. The moment things shifted didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voices echoing through the house. In fact, it happened during one of the quietest afternoons I could remember. It was a Tuesday. Emma was at work. Richard had gone out for one of his long walks, and Margaret had driven into town to run errands. For the first time in days, the house was completely silent. I was sitting at the dining table with my laptop open, reviewing a compliance report from work. Numbers, clauses, reference notes. Nothing unusual. The kind of routine analysis I had done hundreds of times before. But my concentration kept drifting. Not because the work was difficult, because the quiet in the house felt different. When you live somewhere long enough, you begin to feel the rhythms of a place. The sounds of doors opening, footsteps in hallways, and voices from the kitchen. That afternoon, without all of that background noise, the house felt almost like a structure I was seeing clearly for the first time. Just walls, rooms, furniture, a property. That word, property, slipped into my mind almost automatically. Maybe it was because of the documents I worked with every day, ownership structures, legal filings, and contract language. My mind had been trained to think in those terms. Still, I found myself looking around the dining room differently than I ever had before. Not as a family space, as an asset. I noticed the details. The original hardwood floors. The extensions that had clearly been added years apart. The slight angle where the back wall didn't perfectly align with the older part of the house. Small structural clues that hinted at the history of the place. Eventually, I closed my laptop and walked toward the sideboard where Margaret kept a drawer full of household documents. I had opened that drawer many times before while helping organize paperwork, insurance policies, utility bills, council letters, completely ordinary things. But that day, instead of just sorting through the latest mail, I paused. Something about the earlier council notice still lingered in my mind. The reference to property classification, multi-occupancy registrations. It wasn't suspicious, just interesting. I pulled out the folder containing older documents related to the house. Most of them were exactly what you'd expect: insurance renewals, maintenance receipts, and a few outdated service agreements. But buried near the bottom of the folder was a thicker document envelope, the kind solicitors usually send. I didn't open it immediately. For a moment, I just held it in my hands, noticing the slightly faded letterhead from a Manchester law firm. Then I slid the papers out. The top page was exactly what I expected: a property deed. I skimmed the document automatically, the way someone does when they've reviewed similar papers dozens of times before. Owner names, registration numbers, dates, all normal. But as my eyes moved down the page, I slowed. Not because something looked wrong, because something looked incomplete. There was a clause referencing a structural change to the ownership registration several years earlier. An amendment. That wasn't unusual. Properties change legal status all the time. Inheritance adjustments, trust structures, partial transfers. Still, the amendment referenced an additional document, and that document wasn't in the envelope. I flipped through the rest of the papers again. Nothing, which meant one of two things. Either the amendment document had been misplaced, or it had been filed somewhere else, intentionally. I returned the papers to the envelope and slid the folder back into the drawer, exactly the way I found it. Then I sat back down at the dining table, not alarmed, not suspicious, just thoughtful. Because when you work with documents long enough, you develop a certain instinct, a feeling that tells you when a piece of information is missing from a system that otherwise looks complete. And once that feeling appears, it becomes very difficult to ignore. That afternoon, I didn't search any further. I simply went back to my laptop and finished my work. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a small shift had already taken place. Not anger, not frustration, just clarity. For the first time since moving into that house, I had started looking at it not as a family space, but as something defined by paperwork. And paperwork, unlike family dynamics, has a very specific relationship with the truth. After that afternoon, nothing in the house visibly changed. Margaret still ran the kitchen with the same quiet efficiency. Richard still read the paper by the window every morning. Emma still moved easily between her parents and me, never sensing any tension in the air. From the outside, everything looked exactly the same, but something inside me had shifted in a way that was difficult to reverse. Before that day, my silence had mostly been instinctive. I avoided unnecessary disagreements because that's simply the kind of person I've always been. If a conversation didn't require my input, I let it pass. If someone overlooked a point I made, I didn't feel the need to insist on being heard. It felt natural. But now, my silence started to feel deliberate, not defensive, strategic. Because once you suspect that an important piece of information exists somewhere just out of view, the smartest thing you can do isn't to announce your curiosity. It's to observe. So I paid attention in ways I hadn't before. Not just to conversations, but to routines. Margaret had a very particular system for organizing documents in the house. Utility statements were kept in one drawer near the kitchen. Insurance papers lived in a folder upstairs in the study. Anything related to the house itself, repairs, council letters, warranties, usually stayed in the sideboard drawer I had opened that Tuesday afternoon. Except for that one missing amendment document. That detail stayed quietly in the back of my mind. Weeks passed. During that time, I noticed something else interesting. Margaret sometimes mentioned the paperwork when discussing the house with Richard, usually in passing. Make sure the paperwork stays together, she said one evening when they were talking about clearing space in the study. Or once, while sorting through old bills, don't mix those with the house documents. The way she said it suggested there was a very specific category of papers she was referring to, but she never elaborated, and no one asked. I didn't ask either, because asking questions too early has a way of drawing attention you don't need. Instead, I watched. Gradually, I began to notice patterns in when certain drawers or cabinets were opened. Margaret had a habit of organizing documents late in the evening after dinner, when the rest of the house had mostly settled down. One night, while passing through the hallway, I saw the study door slightly open. Margaret was inside. She stood at the desk, with several papers spread out in front of her. Not bills, not insurance forms. These looked more formal. Thicker paper, stamped seals. The kind of documents solicitors usually prepare. She didn't see me in the hallway, and I didn't step into the room. I simply continued walking toward the kitchen as if I hadn't noticed anything at all. Because in moments like that, curiosity can betray you faster than words. Later that night, Emma and I were sitting together in the living room when Margaret came downstairs. She looked completely relaxed. Nothing about her expression suggested she had been handling anything unusual upstairs. That detail stayed with me, because people tend to behave differently when they're dealing with matters they consider important. But Margaret didn't seem nervous, which meant whatever documents she had been reviewing, she believed they were secure. And that belief told me something valuable. There was more paperwork connected to the house than what I had seen in the sideboard drawer. Paperwork important enough to keep separate. Important enough that even someone as organized as Margaret didn't store it with the everyday household records. I didn't confront her. I didn't even mention the study. Instead, over the next few weeks, I did exactly what everyone in that house had always expected me to do. I stayed quiet, helpful, reliable, the same Charles they had grown comfortable with. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a situation like that is allow people to keep believing the version of you they've already decided is true. And in that house, everyone believed they understood exactly who I was, which meant no one was paying attention when I started looking a little more closely at everything around me. Once I started paying closer attention, I realized something that had probably been true from the very beginning. Everyone in that house had grown comfortable with the idea that I handled details, but not decisions. It's an interesting position to occupy, because when people think of you as someone who manages practical things, they rarely question what you're doing while you manage them. You become part of the system, invisible in the way good infrastructure is invisible, and infrastructure has access to everything. Over the next few months, I continued exactly as I always had. When letters arrived from the council, I sorted them. When contractors sent invoices for small repairs, I reviewed them. When Emma asked if I could organize some of the older paperwork cluttering the study shelves, I agreed without hesitation. To everyone else, it probably looked like the same quiet helpfulness they had seen from me for years. But internally, I had started approaching the house the same way I approached complex files at work. Carefully, methodically, without drawing attention. I didn't search through drawers randomly. That would have been careless and obvious. Instead, I waited for moments when organizing paperwork was already a reasonable activity. Margaret herself had asked several times if I could tidy up some of the document folders. She preferred things neat, and she knew I was good at creating orderly systems. So one Saturday morning, while Emma and her mother were out visiting a relative, I began sorting the shelves in the study. The room had slowly become the storage space for decades of household records, old mortgage statements, insurance renewals, tax filings, receipts from renovations that had happened long before Emma and I married. I arranged everything into labeled folders: maintenance, utilities, insurance, council, correspondence. It was the kind of organizational work I had done hundreds of times in professional settings. But this time, I paid attention to something specific. Any document that referenced the legal status of the house, ownership, registration numbers, solicitor correspondence. And slowly, a picture began to form. Most of the paperwork confirmed what I had already seen in the deed envelope downstairs. The house had originally been registered entirely under Richard's name decades earlier. Later, there had been a transfer that added Margaret as a co-owner. Normal, common. But then there was the amendment I had noticed before, the one referencing an additional document. That amendment appeared again in a separate file, this time mentioned in a letter from the solicitor's office. But once again, the referenced document itself wasn't there. Two references, still no actual amendment, which meant it almost certainly existed somewhere else. People rarely reference documents twice without keeping the document itself, and Margaret was far too organized to misplace something that important. So I asked myself a simple question: where would someone keep a document they considered too important to store with the rest of the household files? The answer was surprisingly obvious. Not in the shared study, somewhere private. And in that house, there was really only one place that fit that description: Margaret and Richard's bedroom. I didn't immediately act on that realization. Instead, I finished organizing the study shelves exactly the way Margaret had asked. By the time she returned home that afternoon, the room looked far more orderly than it had in years. She seemed genuinely pleased. "Oh, this is wonderful," she said, while looking at the labeled folders. "You're always so thorough, Charles." I smiled and shrugged slightly, just doing what I always did, helping with practical things. That evening after dinner, I sat with Emma in the living room while Margaret and Richard watched television nearby. Everything felt completely normal, comfortable, predictable, and that was precisely the point, because by then, I understood something about the dynamic in that house that no one else seemed to notice. When people believe they fully understand your role, they stop observing your behavior closely. They assume they already know what you're doing, which meant that while everyone else in that room relaxed into their usual routines, I was quietly considering the next step. Not aggressively, not impatiently, just thoughtfully. Because if the missing document was where I suspected it might be, then the truth about that house had been sitting in the same building with me the entire time, hidden in plain sight. And sometimes, the most powerful discoveries don't require confrontation. They simply require patience, long enough to let the right moment appear. To soften the gray afternoon light. Along the far wall stood a large oak wardrobe and a dresser with several drawers. I didn't start opening things immediately. Instead, I took a moment to look around the room the way I had trained myself to do with unfamiliar files at work. Where would someone keep something important but rarely used? Not somewhere obvious, but also not somewhere inconvenient. People usually store important documents in places that feel secure yet accessible. My eyes settled on the dresser. The top drawers were almost certainly clothing or jewelry, but the bottom drawer was deeper. When I pulled it open, I found neatly folded blankets. Under the blankets sat a slim black lockbox. That alone didn't prove anything. Many families keep small safes for passports or emergency documents. Still, the presence of a lockbox told me I was probably looking in the right place. Fortunately, it wasn't locked. Margaret had simply closed the latch. Inside were exactly the kinds of documents you'd expect: passports, birth certificates, a few sealed envelopes with solicitor letterheads. I lifted the stack carefully and began reading the labels. Marriage certificate, insurance addenda, and then I saw the one I had been expecting. Property registration amendment, the same wording I had seen referenced in the deed envelope. The document was thicker than I expected, several pages long. I carried it to the small writing desk near the window and sat down. As I read the first page, something inside me became very still, not surprised, just focused, because the document confirmed what my instincts had already been telling me. Several years earlier, during a restructuring of the property's ownership registration, the house had been placed under a legal arrangement that was more complex than a simple family transfer. Part of the property's legal structure had been modified through a limited trust agreement, and the trust had three named parties: Richard, Margaret, and a third individual, me. I read the line twice to make sure I hadn't misunderstood it. My name was written clearly in the document: Charles Bennett, not as a witness, not as an advisor, but as a registered beneficiary and co-holder of a conditional property interest, which meant something very specific under UK property law. The house was not solely theirs, not anymore. The amendment had been filed the year Emma and I moved in, apparently during a refinancing process that required an additional registered party connected to the property's legal obligations. And for reasons that became clear as I continued reading, that party had been for me, not because I had asked for it, but because the financial structure at the time had required a legally stable cosigner with strong credit and no outstanding property liabilities, which apparently had described me perfectly. At the time, I had signed several refinancing documents without paying much attention beyond the financial terms. I trusted the solicitor, trusted the process. What I hadn't realized was that the legal structure had quietly granted me a conditional ownership interest tied directly to the property's registration, a detail that had been recorded formally but never discussed again afterward. I closed the document slowly. The room was completely silent, no rush of excitement, no feeling of triumph, just clarity, because in that moment, I understood something that no one else in the house seemed to realize. The assumptions they had built about my role in that family were based on an incomplete understanding of the paperwork. And paperwork has a strange quality. It doesn't care about family hierarchies. It doesn't respond to personality. It simply records facts. I returned the document to the lockbox exactly the way I found it, closed the drawer. Then I walked downstairs and poured another cup of tea. The rain outside had grown heavier, and as I sat there quietly, I thought about something simple. If the situation in that house ever reached a point where someone tried to make a decision about who belonged there, there was one small detail they had clearly forgotten, and that detail was written very clearly in one document. After that afternoon, I carried a new kind of awareness with me. Not excitement, not even satisfaction, just a quiet understanding of the actual structure beneath the life we were all living in that house. On the surface, nothing had changed. Margaret still managed the home as she always had. Richard still carried the quiet authority he'd built over decades. Emma still moved easily between all of us, believing the household was balanced in the same familiar way it had always been. But I now knew something they didn't realize I knew. The legal structure of that house did not match the social structure everyone believed in, and that difference mattered more than anyone seemed to understand. For several weeks, after discovering the amendment document, I didn't act on the information at all. Instead, I gave myself time to think, not about what I could do, but about what I should do. Because having leverage and using leverage are two very different things. The easiest reaction would have been confrontation. I could have walked into the living room one evening, placed a copy of the amendment on the table, and asked a simple question. Why was this never mentioned to me? But that kind of moment rarely leads to clarity. It leads to defensiveness, arguments. Emotions are rising faster than facts. And that wasn't the kind of outcome I wanted. So I considered the possible paths carefully. One option was to ignore the information completely, continue living exactly the way I had been living, continue playing the quiet role everyone had assigned to me. Technically, nothing in the document required me to change anything. But that option came with a problem. Because once you know the truth about your position in a situation, pretending not to know it becomes very difficult. Another option was to speak privately with Emma. She deserved honesty, and I trusted her. But I also understood something about Yish family dynamics that complicated that idea. If I told Emma first, the information would almost certainly reach Margaret and Richard quickly, probably before Emma fully understood the legal details herself. And once that happened, the situation would shift into a reactive conversation. Again, emotion before clarity. The final option was quieter, more deliberate, and, in many ways, irreversible. Instead of discussing the document immediately, I could verify the details independently, confirm the registration through official property records, understand exactly what rights the amendment created. In other words, I could make sure that what I had seen in that bedroom drawer meant precisely what it appeared to mean. Not because I distrusted the document, but clarity is strongest when it doesn't depend on a single source. That decision felt right almost immediately. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't secretive. It was simply responsible. After all, my name was attached to the legal structure of that house. If I were going to carry that responsibility, I needed to understand it completely. So, the next Monday morning, during a quiet break at work, I opened the UK Land Registry database. Property records are public information if you know how to access them properly. The search took less than 5 minutes. When the registration summary appeared on my screen, I leaned back in my chair and read it slowly. Address, registration number, ownership classification, and there it was again. The amendment, the same trust structure I had seen in the physical document. 3 registered parties, Richard, Margaret, and Charles Bennett. My name, not hidden in a clause, not secondary, recorded clearly as part of the property's legal structure. At that point, something inside me settled, because verification changes the emotional weight of a discovery. Before that moment, the document had been a possibility. Now it was a fact, and facts have consequences, whether people choose to acknowledge them or not. I closed the database window and returned to my work. No one in my office noticed anything different. Just another quiet morning. But internally, a decision had already been made. Not about confrontation, not about revenge, just about something simple. If a day ever came when someone in that house tried to decide where I belonged, I would be ready to answer, calmly, clearly, and with exactly the amount of information required. Once I confirmed the registration through the land registry, I didn't rush to do anything dramatic. In fact, my daily routine barely changed at all. That was intentional. Because when people suddenly change their behavior, others start asking questions. And questions often arrive before you're ready to answer them. So I kept everything the same. I still helped Margaret organize household documents when she asked. I still handled small repairs around the house. I still sat quietly during family dinners, contributing only when something practical came up. From the outside, I was still the same Charles everyone had grown used to. But internally, I had begun doing something different. I started preparing, not for conflict, for clarity. At work, I was already used to dealing with complex paperwork, reviewing legal clauses, identifying obligations, and understanding how different documents are connected to one another. So during lunch breaks or quiet evenings, I began reading more carefully about the type of trust structure attached to the property. Not obsessively, just enough to understand the boundaries. What rights did each registered party actually have? What kinds of decisions required mutual agreement? What circumstances could trigger changes in the ownership structure? Most of the answers were straightforward. The amendment had been created primarily to satisfy lending conditions during the refinancing several years earlier. That meant the trust structure established shared legal responsibility connected to the property. In practical terms, that meant one important thing. Major decisions involving the house couldn't be made unilaterally, not by Richard, not by Margaret, not by anyone. Every registered party had to be involved. That detail alone explained why the amendment had been written so carefully by the solicitor. Banks tend to prefer clarity when property obligations are shared. Once I understood that, I did one more simple thing. I ordered an official copy of the property registration from the land registry. Anyone listed on a property record has the right to obtain certified documentation. The request took less than 10 minutes online. A week later, the envelope arrived at my office. I opened it at my desk. Inside were several stamped pages confirming exactly what I had already seen in the database: the address, the amendment, and the 3 registered parties. I slid the papers into the same leather document folder I had carried to work for years. The folder wasn't special, just something I had owned for a long time, but it had become a habit of mine to keep important things inside it. I didn't bring the folder home that day, not immediately. Instead, I left it in my office drawer for a while, partly because there was no reason to rush, partly because I wanted to make sure I understood something clearly before taking the next step. For the next few weeks, life in the house continued exactly as it always had. Margaret organized dinners. Richard watched the evening news. Emma and I went about our routines. If anything, the atmosphere felt calm, almost comfortable. But sometimes, calm environments hide small currents moving underneath. One evening, while Margaret and Richard were discussing future plans for the house renovations, I noticed something subtle in Margaret's tone. She was speaking about the house as if certain decisions had already been made: expanding the kitchen, rearranging the upstairs rooms, even possibly reconsidering who lived where. At the time, no one looked at me directly when those words were spoken. It was just part of a larger conversation. But I heard it, and I understood something in that moment. There was a possibility, however distant, that someone in that house believed they had the authority to decide whether I belonged there. Not maliciously, just confidently, the way people do when they assume the structure around them works the way they think it does. That night, after Emma and I went upstairs, I finally brought the leather folder home from my office. I placed it quietly inside my desk drawer, not because I planned to use it, but sometimes preparation isn't about expecting conflict. It's simply about being ready for the moment when someone else decides to create it. For a while, after that conversation about renovations, nothing seemed to happen, at least not directly, but small shifts began appearing in the atmosphere of the house. Subtle things, the kind that might seem insignificant if you weren't paying attention. I was paying attention. Margaret started speaking more frequently about future arrangements, usually during dinner, in a tone that suggested the decisions had already been thought through somewhere privately. The house needs to evolve as people's lives change, she said one evening while clearing plates. Richard nodded slowly. Emma didn't react much. She was focused on a project at work and often looked mentally exhausted by the time dinner ended. But I noticed the way Margaret occasionally glanced at the empty chair across the table when she talked about space in the house. Not accusatory, just thoughtful, as if imagining possibilities. Around the same time, another change appeared. Margaret began reorganizing rooms, not dramatically, just small adjustments. Old furniture was moved out of storage. The spare bedroom upstairs was cleared out. Boxes labeled for donation are stacked neatly near the hallway. Spring cleaning, she said lightly when Emma asked about it. It was autumn. Still, no one questioned it. Families often rearrange things without any deeper meaning behind them. But what interested me wasn't the physical changes in the house. It was the language Margaret started using when she spoke about them. One evening, while Richard and Emma were discussing a neighbor's recent move, Margaret made an offhand comment. It's healthy for households to rebalance from time to time, she said. The word rebalance lingered in the room for a moment. Emma nodded absently. I said nothing, because by then, I understood something about the way Margaret approached decisions. She rarely introduced them directly. Instead, she prepared the environment first. Small ideas are planted in casual conversations. Concepts were repeated gently until they felt familiar. By the time a decision was actually spoken aloud, it no longer felt sudden. It felt inevitable, and that realization told me something important. Whatever Margaret was planning regarding the house, she believed she had the authority to implement it. That belief wasn't hostile, it was simply confident. Built on decades of living in the same space and managing every aspect of the household. From her perspective, the structure of the house probably seemed obvious. Richard owned it. She shared it. Emma was their daughter, and I was Emma's husband who happened to live there. Useful, polite, temporary, perhaps, but not central. Meanwhile, my own behavior remained unchanged. I still fixed the loose cabinet hinge in the kitchen when Margaret mentioned it. I still reviewed a council letter about waste collection changes when Richard asked if I could take a quick look. From their perspective, I was exactly the same person I had always been, which meant none of them noticed the one thing that had quietly changed. I had stopped reacting emotionally to the small signals in the house. No frustration, no confusion, just observation. Because once you know the factual structure beneath a situation, the emotional surface becomes easier to watch calmly. The real consequences of misunderstandings rarely appear immediately. They build slowly, usually in the form of assumptions. And in that house, one assumption had been growing stronger every day. The assumption that Margaret and Richard had the final word on who belonged there. An assumption that, sooner or later, was going to lead to a conversation. Not angry, not dramatic, just decisive. And when that conversation finally arrived, I suspected it would come across the same dining table where so many quiet misunderstandings had already taken place. The conversation happened on a Sunday evening, which in hindsight made perfect sense. Margaret had always believed important family matters should be discussed during Sunday dinner. It was the one time she could be sure everyone would be present and seated long enough to listen. That night, the table was set exactly the way it always was. Roast lamb, steamed vegetables, the same white plates Margaret had used for years. Nothing about the room suggested anything unusual. But as soon as we sat down, I noticed the difference in Margaret's posture. She wasn't relaxed. She was composed, the way someone looks when they've already rehearsed what they plan to say. Emma noticed it too. Everything all right? She asked casually while reaching for the salt. Margaret smiled politely. Yes, dear. I just thought this would be a good time for us to talk about something. Richard cleared his throat softly, but didn't interrupt. The room became a little quieter. Margaret folded her hands together on the table before speaking again. You all know the house has gone through many changes over the years, she began, and lately I've been thinking about what makes the most sense for everyone moving forward. Emma looked curious but calm. I said nothing. Margaret continued. With Emma's career growing and Richard and I getting older, it's probably time we start simplifying the living arrangements in the house. Her tone remained gentle, practical, like someone explaining a logistical adjustment. Emma frowned slightly. What do you mean? Margaret turned her gaze toward me for the first time that evening. Not sharply, just directly. Well, she said, choosing her words carefully. Charles has been very helpful while staying here, and we truly appreciate that. The phrasing was precise. While staying here. Past tense already forming. But this was always meant to be temporary, she added. And it might be healthier for everyone if Charles and Emma started thinking about finding a place of their own. Emma blinked. I thought we were helping you and Dad here, she said slowly. You have been, Margaret replied quickly. And we're grateful. Then she turned slightly toward me again. But at the end of the day, this is still the family home. The phrase hung in the air. Family home. Richard nodded quietly beside her, not aggressively, just in agreement. Emma looked between her parents and me, trying to process the shift in tone. This feels sudden, she said. Margaret shook her head gently. Oh, it's not sudden. I've been thinking about it for quite some time. Then she said the sentence that made everything unmistakably clear. I think it would be best if Charles made arrangements to move out within the next couple of months. The room became very still. Emma turned toward me immediately. What? I could see the confusion in her eyes. She hadn't expected this. And Margaret clearly believed the decision had already been made, not as a punishment, not even as a conflict, just a practical conclusion. From her perspective, it probably felt perfectly reasonable. Parents reclaiming their home, a married couple starting their own life elsewhere. A simple adjustment, but there was one detail Margaret had overlooked when planning this conversation. A detail that had been sitting quietly in my desk drawer upstairs for weeks. Emma started speaking again, her voice rising slightly. Mom, you can't just... Margaret lifted a hand gently. Emma, please. Let's keep this calm. Then she looked at me with the same composed expression she had worn all evening. Charles, I hope you understand this isn't personal. It's simply about what makes the most sense for the household. I nodded once, calmly, not because I agreed, but because, by that point, I understood something Margaret didn't yet realize. The moment she had chosen to frame the conversation this way was the moment the situation became impossible to quietly reverse. Because when people make decisions based on assumptions about authority, those assumptions eventually meet the structure of reality. And reality, in this case, was written very clearly on a few pages of official paperwork. Paperwork that no one at that table seemed to remember. For a few seconds, after Margaret finished speaking, no one at the table moved. Emma looked stunned. Richard stared quietly at his plate, as if waiting for the moment to pass. Margaret sat upright, hands still folded together, clearly believing she had handled the situation calmly and reasonably. I took a sip of water before responding, not to delay, just to keep the rhythm of the moment steady. Margaret, I said evenly, I understand what you're saying. Emma turned toward me immediately. Charles, you don't have to... It's all right, I said gently, resting a hand on her arm. Then I looked back at Margaret. You're right about one thing, I continued. Conversations about living arrangements should be calm. Margaret nodded slightly, relieved perhaps that the situation wasn't escalating. That's exactly what I hoped, she said. I paused for a moment, not because I was uncertain about what to say, but timing matters when you're correcting a misunderstanding. Before we talk about moving arrangements, I said quietly, there's something important I think we should all look at together. Margaret frowned slightly. What do you mean? I stood up from the table. No drama, I said calmly. Just paperwork. Emma watched me with growing curiosity. I walked upstairs to the small desk in our room and opened the drawer where the leather folder had been sitting for weeks. The folder felt familiar in my hands. I carried it downstairs slowly and returned to the dining room. Margaret's expression had shifted from confidence to mild confusion. Richard looked up. Emma leaned forward slightly. I placed the folder on the table and opened it. Inside were the official land registry copies I had ordered weeks earlier. Carefully, I slid the top document across the table toward Margaret. "I think this might help clarify something," I said. Margaret glanced down at the page. At first, her expression didn't change. Property documents are full of technical language. It takes a moment to understand what you're looking at. Her eyes moved slowly across the lines. Address, registration number, ownership structure. Then she reached the section listing the registered parties connected to the trust amendment. I watched the exact moment the meaning registered. Her posture stiffened slightly. Richard leaned closer to see the page. Emma looked between all of us, confused. "What is it?" she asked. No one answered immediately. Margaret turned the page again, as if hoping the wording might change. It didn't. Richard adjusted his glasses and read the section more carefully. Then he looked up at me. "You're listed here," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied. Emma blinked. "Listed as what?" I spoke gently, keeping my voice completely neutral. "A registered party connected to the property's legal structure." Margaret's eyes moved back to the document again. Her voice was softer now. "That must be related to the refinancing years ago." "It is," I said. Another silence settled over the table, the kind of silence that appears when a room suddenly realizes something important has been overlooked. No one was angry. No one raised their voice. But the emotional atmosphere had shifted completely because the conversation Margaret had prepared so carefully about who belonged in the house and who didn't had just encountered a detail she hadn't accounted for. And in that moment, the room went completely silent. The silence after Margaret finished reading the document lasted longer than anyone probably expected. Not awkward, just heavy. Emma was the first to speak. "So, what does this mean?" she asked, looking between her parents and me. Richard leaned back in his chair slowly, still holding the page. "It means," he said carefully, "that the refinancing agreement created a shared legal structure tied to the property." Margaret didn't say anything yet. She was still staring at the document, her expression no longer confident or defensive, just thoughtful. I spoke gently. "It doesn't change the fact that this is your family home," I said. "That history is real." Margaret looked up at me then. For the first time that evening, her tone carried something different. Not authority, recognition. "Why didn't you mention this before?" she asked quietly. I considered the question for a moment. "Because it never seemed necessary," I replied. And that was the truth. Until that dinner conversation, the document had simply been a detail in the background of our lives. Something recorded legally but never relevant emotionally. Emma looked at the paper again. "So, technically, Charles can't just be asked to leave?" I shook my head slightly. "It's not about that," I said. "The point isn't whether I can stay or go." Margaret folded the document slowly. The careful certainty she had carried into the conversation earlier was gone now, not replaced by embarrassment, just recalibration. "I see," she said quietly. Richard cleared his throat. "Well," he added, "that certainly changes how the situation needs to be discussed." And that was exactly the shift that had needed to happen. Not an argument, not a victory, just a correction of the assumptions in the room. The conversation that followed was calmer than anyone might expect. Emma asked questions about the refinancing process from years earlier. Richard explained that the solicitor had recommended adding my name to strengthen the lending structure. Margaret listened quietly. Eventually, she looked at me again. "You must have found this recently," she said. "A few months ago," I answered. She nodded slowly. Another pause settled over the table, but this time it felt different. not tense, reflective, because the reality of the situation had quietly rearranged the emotional hierarchy in the room, not dramatically, just enough that everyone understood the conversation had to move forward differently now. Later that night, after the dishes were cleared, and Emma and I went upstairs, she turned to me with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. You never told me about any of this. I didn't know about it either at first, I said honestly. Emma sat down on the edge of the bed. So, what happens now? I thought about that for a moment. Probably the same thing that should have happened tonight in the first place, I said. What's that? A conversation where everyone understands the actual situation. Emma smiled faintly. That would be a nice change. I smiled too. Because in truth, nothing about the house itself had changed. The walls were the same. The people were the same. But something subtle inside the family dynamic had shifted. Not because I had fought for it, just because the truth had finally entered the room. And sometimes, that's all it takes to redefine how people see you. A few weeks after that dinner, life in the house settled into a new rhythm, not dramatically different, just more balanced. Margaret still organized family meals. Richard still read the news by the window each morning. Emma still moved through the house with the quiet familiarity of someone who had grown up there. But conversations change. Decisions about the house, repairs, renovations, future plans became discussions instead of announcements. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood something important now. The structure of the house wasn't exactly what they had assumed it was, and neither was the role I played inside it. Margaret and I eventually had a quiet conversation in the kitchen one afternoon while Emma was out. She didn't apologize directly. That wasn't her style. Instead, she said something that meant more. I suppose I had gotten used to thinking of the house the way it used to be, she admitted. That's understandable, I told her. Decades of living somewhere can make the present feel permanent. But life changes slowly, and sometimes the paperwork records those changes long before people emotionally accept them. She nodded. And you handled it very calmly. I smiled slightly. I didn't want to embarrass anyone. That part mattered to me. Because correcting a misunderstanding doesn't require humiliation. It just requires clarity. The leather folder still sits in my desk drawer today. Not because I expect to use it again, but it reminds me of something simple that took me years to fully understand. Being quiet doesn't mean being powerless, and being patient doesn't mean you've accepted the role other people assign to you. Sometimes, silence is just someone taking the time to understand the situation fully before choosing the right moment to speak. In the end, nothing dramatic happened in our family. No arguments, no broken relationships. Just one document was placed on a dining table, followed by a long moment where everyone in the room realized they had misunderstood something important. The room went completely silent, and in that silence, a lot of assumptions quietly disappeared. So now I'm curious about something. Have you ever been in a situation where people underestimated you simply because you stayed calm and didn't argue back? I'd really like to hear your story.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.